On behalf of the Texas Lottery Commission, Charitable Bingo Operations Division, welcome to the Bingo Training. This training consists of 6 modules. These modules are directed to the bingo chairperson and the unit designated agent. Everyone involved in bingo operations is encouraged to take this training. Throughout the training, we will be using abbreviations like BEA for Bingo Enabling Act, Rule for Charitable Bingo Administrative Rule, BSP for Bingo Services Portal, and Commission for the Texas Lottery Commission, Charitable Bingo Operations Division. Now let's take a look at the 5th module, Record Keeping Part 2. In this module, we will discuss record keeping to include the following: organization's charitable purpose, use of proceeds, charitable distributions, permissible expenses, cash disbursement journal, debit card transactions, inventory, and gift certificates log. The organizing instruments set forth the basic terms and purpose of an organization. The records an organization keeps related to the charitable purpose may include bylaws, constitution, charter, and articles of incorporation or certificate of formation. The Commission uses all of these documents to determine if an organization uses its proceeds from bingo appropriately. The BEA and rules regulate the use of bingo proceeds for charitable purposes. The organization's organizing instruments indicate in writing the cause, deed or activity that is consistent with the organization's purpose, and objectives from which the charitable distribution/net proceeds from bingo will be used. These purposes must be consistent with the charitable purpose under which the organization qualifies as a nonprofit, or otherwise authorized organization in accordance with BEA Section 2001.002, and the authorized organization's proceeds from the bingo games must be spent in Texas for charitable purposes. Documents need to be retained by the organization that will validate how the organization spent the proceeds from bingo. The organization may have documents and records not discussed in this training, which might serve as support documents on how the organization used its proceeds from bingo. The BEA lists certain criteria for permissible expenses in 2 terms: reasonable and necessary. It states that a licensed authorized organization may pay for necessary or reasonable bona fide expenses from the bingo account. For the purposes of permissible expenses, reasonable is defined as appropriate in amount as it relates to the conduct of bingo, moderate or fair in amount, not extreme or excessive, does not substantially exceed the average rate or retail cost for the goods or services, and if the organization followed generally accepted sound business practices. Another question that is often asked involves member travel to conventions. Travel expenses incurred for a seminar, convention, or retreat primarily to discuss the charitable functions and objectives of the organization may be allowable. By now, I'm sure you've gotten the idea that everything must be documented, and the use of proceeds for travel is no exception. Documentation for travel expenses must include itinerary showing the purpose of the travel and how it relates to the charitable purposes or activities, original receipts or correct copies of actual out-of-pocket, necessary, and reasonable expenses, and employee or member request for payment or reimbursement. Organizations may not use net proceeds from the conduct of bingo for charitable distribution directly or indirectly to benefit any private shareholder, individual, officer, governing body, or member other than as reasonable compensation for services rendered or for a cause or deed consistent with the organization's charitable purpose. Therefore, Any payment to a member of the organization will only be considered charitable if it was payment for a service rendered related to the cause, deed, or activity of the organization. Remember, the funds that are distributed for charitable purposes cannot be used for any bingo expenses. Giving the funds to another organization or person does not change the fact that the money must be used for the charitable purposes of the organization. We often get calls from organizations that want to use the funds for something that is not in line with their stated charitable purposes. Organizations ask if they can give money to their auxiliary, and then the auxiliary will spend money for the non-charitable activity. The answer is no. It does not matter who does the actual spending. The purpose to what the money must be used for remains the same. Proceeds disbursed for charitable purposes must be documented. The documentation should capture the actual expenditure and show that the disbursement was used for an authorized purpose. Here are a few of the records that are supporting documentation for the organization's use of net proceeds. They include bank records, such as canceled checks, deposit slips, and bank statements. Just as with the permissible expenses, canceled checks alone are not sufficient to document the expense of a charitable distribution. However, they are a great tool in conjunction with some of the other acceptable records we will discuss. An example of some of the records that may be used as supporting documentation for the organization's use of their bingo net proceeds include meeting minutes. Organizations should discuss and agree how they will spend their net proceeds. Their meeting minutes should document the discussion and the decision with respect to the net proceeds. Committee minutes. If the organization has a special committee, such as a charitable committee or a committee for education that oversees the disbursements, then the committee minutes can be used as support documentation. Thank you letter. If a recipient receives support, such as a family the organization provided groceries for during a disaster, or a child who was a recipient of a scholarship writes a thank you letter, maintain these for the organization's records. Newspaper articles. Be certain to keep any newspaper write-ups the organization receives related to charitable activity the organization provided proceeds toward. Receipts. Other proof of payment invoices or written acknowledgement serve as support documentation. Also, related to scholarships, be sure to have written scholarship criteria available. For more information on supporting documentation, see Rules Section 402.502C. When regarding the reasonableness of an expense, the Commission will consider if it exceeds what a prudent person would have incurred under similar circumstances, if the person authorizing the expense acted with prudence, considering the circumstances of the organization, if the expense was unjustifiably increased because of a difference in the standard business practices of the organization. What is meant in the BEA when it talks about necessary expenses? Necessary expenses are defined as those essential to the conduct of bingo. In order to determine if an expense is necessary, the Commission will consider these three things: whether the goods or services are justifiably required to conduct bingo, whether they are generally recognized as a bingo expense, and if the expenditure might contribute to additional proceeds to be used for charitable purposes. The BEA provides a list of items that fall within the area of reasonable and necessary expenses. They include advertising, including the cost of printing bingo gift certificates, security, repairs to the premises, and equipment such as plumbing and HVAC, bingo supplies and equipment, prizes, rent, mortgage, and insurance. Be sure to look at the BEA Section 2001.458 for the complete list of reasonable and necessary expenses. They may also include bookkeeping, accounting, and legal services, payroll for bingo workers, janitorial and utility services and supplies, attending bingo-related training courses, and debit card transaction fees, bank fees, cash over or short, and electronic funds transfer fees. Shared permissible expenses, or allocation of expenses, is when a licensed authorized organization may pay only its proportional share of any shared expenses. Expenses incurred that are shared with an activity not related to the conduct of bingo must be allocated to the extent the bingo operation benefited from the product or service. Expenses must be allocated on a reasonable basis among the activities that benefited. One example may be electricity, which is prorated at a multi-use facility. That expense must be divided among what is used for bingo and what is used for non-bingo activities. Another example may be janitorial or security services that have been contracted for a set amount each month. The monthly bill must then be divided among the charities based on the number of occasions and other member activities at the location. As with all other transactions involved in bingo, sufficient records must be maintained to document all expenses. So just how does the organization document expenses? What we will look for includes invoices, itemized receipts, payroll registers and payroll tax returns, lease agreements. The documentation should include specific details of the expense. Additional records that can be used to document permissible expenses include bank statements, canceled checks, and a cash disbursements journal. Please note that bank records and canceled checks do not provide sufficient backup documentation alone. There must be additional supporting records. When it comes to documenting permissible expenses, it is important to remember that in addition to documenting the purchase of a particular good or service, the organization should be able to show how it benefited bingo operations. Under Rule Section 402.505, the Commission may disallow any expense item which is not adequately supported or is not reasonably or necessarily expended in connection with the conduct of any game of bingo. Documentation of bingo expenses is of the utmost importance to having a successful bingo operation. We talked about how beneficial the sales journal is in compiling the sales, and the cash disbursements journal or an equivalent report is recommended for the same reason for the expenses portion of the quarterly report. It is an excellent tool for compiling and organizing the details of expenditures for the quarter. To use the journal, the specifics for each expense item are entered, and then the expense amount is categorized based on the corresponding quarterly report line item. Each column is totaled at the end of the quarter, and these amounts are then transferred to the proper quarterly report line. Debit cards can be accepted as payment for bingo products, but credit cards cannot be accepted as payment. All debit card transaction funds must be deposited into the organization's bingo checking account within 72 hours of the transaction. In addition to a copy of each debit card sales receipt, it is important to maintain records to reflect the timely deposit of funds into the organization's or unit's bingo account and the fees and expenses related to the debit card transactions. Also, it is required that all debit card transactions and fees must be reported on the quarterly reports for the time period in which they occurred. Another area of bingo operations that must be supported with appropriate records and documentation is debit card transactions. Debit card transactions involve both bingo gross receipts and expenses. Although debit cards are a means of payment for bingo products, the use of a debit card by bingo patrons usually results in bank fees being charged to the organization's bingo checking account. Please note that for all debit card transactions, a sales receipt must be issued to the purchaser and a copy of the receipt kept by the organization for their records. Managing inventory. Inventory equals money. Missing inventory is missing money that could be used for charitable purposes. Therefore, managing inventory is essential for a successful bingo operation. Organizations must maintain a perpetual inventory of all disposable bingo cards and all pull tabs. These records tie to organization records and help the organization to account for all its bingo products. A licensed authorized organization may be held responsible for the gross receipts, prizes, and prize fees associated with missing or unaccounted for disposable bingo cards. So what happens if the organization has old or damaged pull tabs, or paper they are never going to sell again, and want to get rid of? Can they just throw it away? The answer is no. The organization is still responsible for the accountability of the inventory. If the organization needs to dispose of unwanted bingo paper or pull tabs, it must be destroyed in the presence of a commission representative. The licensed authorized organization must complete an inventory of all bingo supplies to be destroyed, along with the appropriate forms, and submit the paperwork to the commission. This paperwork will be reviewed, and a date scheduled for commission staff to witness the destruction of the bingo supplies. The destruction and the disposal of the bingo paper or pull tabs will be the organization's responsibility, and the commission staff member's function will be to verify the inventory counts and observe the destruction. The commission requires all bingo records to be retained for 4 years. After 4 years, a witnessed destruction is not required. Documentation is required to support the destruction of bingo supplies. The following forms are the Commission's recommended templates: Form ID 80, Form ID 81, Form ID 82, and Form ID 83. These forms are available on the CBOD website. Now let's touch on gift certificates records. If the organization is selling gift certificates, a gift certificate log must be maintained. Reconciliation and entry should be done after each bingo occasion, and specific information must be maintained. Also, if the gift certificate was awarded as a bingo or door prize, it must be recorded on the date of the bingo occasion, and the date the prize was awarded on the log, and it must be paid before it is awarded as a prize. This completes Module 5, Record Keeping, Part 2.